Autobiographies are not historical facts. That's not why they're written. They're our own identity narrative truths. And Donald Spence, the famous psychiatrist, sort of talks about this, and I think it's important to realize that. They're not a strict accounting of what happened in his life, but it's his way of making sense of who he is, how the exercises came to be, and so forth. So with that eye towards this, choose each of the episodes, and what does this say about him? What belief did this lead to? What was he trying to really say here and communicate to us through this particular episode? And it's a way to kind of, I think, develop some deeper understanding of really what he was trying to communicate to us. Because really a narrator and an autobiographer, they're trying to tell us who they are. They're trying to tell us about what they believe and how they came to these beliefs and convictions. That's what it is autobiography. It's not a history book. Never confuse the two. There's some overlap, of course, but they're not the same thing. He was trying to communicate a message here. And what is that? And I think as you look and delve into each of the episodes in his life, which are very distinct, I think you start to get a better sense of what he was about. Ignatius's autobiography is unique. It's written and only covers really 18 years of his life. And it's provided to one of his companions on 3 different occasions. And so he didn't write this himself. He narrated it to somebody, recorded it for him. And what's interesting is Ignatius, I think, did this towards the end of his life, not long before his death. And his intent was really, I think, to try to explain God's work in his life. So what you get in his autobiography really isn't a strict accounting of his entire life. It's really, in his mind, where he saw and when he saw God working in his life. So that'll be really the kind of the focus of my comments, is really about that brief period in his life and trying to make sense of that from a narrative perspective. The other thing I just want to touch on briefly is why do people choose to write an autobiography? And again, trying to gain some insight into what was going on for Ignatius. His experience, as he shares it in some of the writings, is he wanted in some way to communicate, I think, what he was about through the form of his own story. So that's intriguing. That's kind of interesting, because you think about why do people write stories? Anyone, really. What I've discovered is a lot of people want to write their story as a way, 1, to make sense of their lives for themselves, but 2, to communicate who they are and what they believe. And I just want to touch on those 2 sort of areas and briefly, just to give you some sense of that. My wife finished up her PhD last year here at Gonzaga University in Leadership Studies, and her dissertation was really focused on elements of resilience in former Latino gang members. In other words, what caused some gang members to exit gang life, and why do others stay in it? So she spent a summer, 2 summers ago, interviewing down in Los Angeles at the gang sort of prevention center there called Homeboys Industries. She spent the summer with 6 guys, basically, doing extensive and in-depth interviews with each of them. And this was what's interesting about that, is she was moved by just powerful stories of these kids being in and out of jail. And Father Greg Boyle, who's the leader, of course, of Homeboys Industries down there, is really an influential figure for them. But what was most intriguing was how grateful they were that someone would listen to their story. And she and I processed that quite a bit after she was done. And I said, why do you think that they were so grateful? She goes, I don't know. It seemed to be that they felt like important that somebody wanted to hear their story. But more importantly, she said, it's almost as if their lives made sense now because they shared their story. And when I began to do some research on that, and really what I've come to is I think we strive to live lives of meaning and purpose, and our stories have to be coherent. They have to make sense in some way. It's a meaning-making process, writing your own autobiography, I think. And I think what these guys were doing was making sense of their lives in a very positive way. They've come out of it. Now they can be influences in a positive way for their own kids, but also kids in neighborhoods where they grew up. So now their lives made sense. And so I think with Ignatius, he's also about trying to sort of make sense of his life to his companions, really, and that's really the purpose of his autobiography, is to do that. So the whole notion of writing one's story, self-narrative, is really a process of meaning making, and that's what he's doing. Now, for the audience, what is it about the autobiography that's interesting for people reading someone's autobiography? I think it's about validation. I think people seek, to understand someone who maybe they admire, they're intrigued by, And they want to know if their lives and their life story validates their sort of admiration of them, if that makes sense at all. So I think followers want to know the leader's story, as a way to kind of gain deeper insight into why they are the way they are, what they believe. And if you know someone's story, think about this. When you know someone's story, you know something about them. Too often, I think we know people, but honestly, until you have experience really of hearing their story, you don't have a real sense of them. And I think that's what Ignatius is trying to do here with his story, is help people get to know him. And in a way, it validates, because all the experiences he shares, the hardships, the struggles, the exercises make sense, after you hear his story, because that's where the exercises came from, out of his experience. This is what worked for me. It's the same with Gandhi. The subtitle of his story, of course, is My Experiments with Truth, and that's really what he was trying to do there, is explore what was true for him, and out of that came this rich sort of learning for everybody that's ever read and kind of followed his story. So returning to Ignatius, so with all this background and narrative and autobiography and turning points and so forth and coherence making, what does that help us maybe understand in terms of Ignatius's story? Well, he opens his story really with, up until the age of 26, he lived a life of vanity and seeking fame and fortune, kind of. And so it's very interesting that he doesn't really want to spend a lot of time up until that point in his life, because I think in his mind, nothing mattered till then. In terms of God acting in his life, he really didn't see that. And I think it's interesting to read back, and he always sought fame, and I think he wanted to be maybe a heroic soldier and seek the fortune that came with that and so forth. But we move up till he's 26 years old. So we have the battle there in Pamplona. The French are attacking, and he gets injured pretty severely, his legs with a cannonball, both legs actually. So he's taken care of, and he sort of talks about the French being kind and taking care of him. But eventually he makes his way back to Loyola. And he begins to sort of heal a little bit, and there's a lot of risks there. So there's a sense of God acting there. That they'd given him up for dead, and somehow he makes this miraculous recovery. So what does he start reading? He'd like to read sort of novels that were just sort of fun and interesting, but all that's really available for him to read are the lives of the saints. So he begins to read these lives, and heroism and fame and fortune take on a very different turn for him now. He sees people making tremendous sacrifices. He reads about the lives of saints who give everything up, to serve God. And so it's a very interesting turning point now we begin, because what draws him is the appeal of that life and that lifestyle, and even thinks about the possibility of entering a monastery. But instead he takes the pilgrimage, and with that comes bunches of insights, obviously, and changes in his life. But for me, the focus is on the turning point experience there, that as he begins to read the lives of the saints, he's drawn to that. And I don't know if it's entirely a selfless way, but I think he's drawn to the appeal of greatness, but in a very different kind of way. And this is in becoming a soldier for God, really, in a lot of ways. So that's the turning point experience for me. After that, there's tremendous number of accounts and events that occur, which I'd be happy just to comment on. But for me, the key is the turning point experience and what that reveals about him, because that says everything, I think, about what his new life. And if you look at Bruner's characteristics of turning points, creates a certain energy in a new direction, new values, beliefs. All those things are true for Ignatius. Like any other, I think, great autobiography, there's these moments that define him. After that, we begin, and again, he describes himself as a pilgrim. He doesn't want to use I. He talks about the pilgrim, So I think there is an attempt there of being selfless and so forth. But what's engaging, of course, along the way is the who I am story, which is his autobiography, and the turning point becomes a who we are story too, which is really the beginning of the Society of Jesus, which is another kind of story. Noel Tishy, in his book, The Leadership Engine, talks about three kinds of leadership stories. One is a who I am, like autobiographies. One is a who we are, which are team, group, department, organizational stories. And finally, there's future stories. But I think what Ignatius does in his autobiography is shift a bit from a who I am to a who we are story towards the end, which is a wonderful way to end it, I think. And that's where it really takes it, And again, there's turning points in the life of the society as well, very similar to the ones he experienced. But for me, at least, the turning point of the Ignatius story is really in the healing process that occurs. These events are often difficult. There's a writer named Joan Chittister, a nun, Sister Joan Chittister, who writes a lot about the spirituality of struggle, which I have really found fascinating. And she talks about these moments in people's lives that apparently are disastrous. That everything's fallen apart. All their dreams, their hopes have all been washed away. But she said in that offers a new possibility, a new direction, maybe the hand of God. And I think for Ignatius, my bet is he went through a real period of loss and even depression as he came to grips with his sort of hope and dreams of being a famous soldier and nobleman and so forth began to drift away. But something else sort of took its place. And that's where the reading the lives of the saints, I think, are so important. So I think for Ignatius, at least, the turning point is kind of the moment, I think, that I find most intriguing and interesting. And as you read his story, with that set of eyes, begin to think about your own experience of change and transformation. This is how he made sense of his life. Now the question is how will you make sense of yours? An exercise I do with undergraduate students frequently is to ask them to identify key values they hold around leadership especially. So things like trust, integrity, honesty, and so forth. And then what I ask them to do is dig a little deeper into their own life story. And frequently I'll have students with timeline, just basically a line across a sheet of paper with the birth date to the current date as sort of the bookends there, and fill in the key moments in your life, and just sort of do that as an initial exercise. And then we go to what are the values, what are the beliefs that most guide who you are as a person and what you sort of underlie your leadership, quite frankly. And then I ask them to make a connection. Is there a way to make a connection between your beliefs and your values and some of the stories from your life? Metaphorically, I ask people to begin to create a library of stories from their lives that they'll have in their psyche and their memory somewheres. Pull a story off the shelf. And what value, what belief, what conviction do you hold today that in some ways connected, to one of these stories from your bookshelf? It's a simple exercise, really, and I'm always surprised that people can do it, because it seemed like, well, there was a lot of influences there and stuff, but in the end, there's a few core beliefs to who we are, so I call it like a leadership brand or a personal brand. What are the stories that kind of led to that? And for Ignatius, I think you'd have to, and I'd invite students to really do that deeply, is for each of you to take and part of the exercises, for example, and as you look at his life, what experience seemed to kind of lead to that particular practice or belief that he engages in or suggests we do in the exercises? Because there really are, I think, experiences we could sort of identify. Because that's key. God acted in his life in his stories. I mean, that's where all the beliefs came from for the exercises, for example, his practices. That's the product of experience in our life. And saints are everyday people, and I just... I know there's the experience where God jumps down in front of somebody, I guess, and says, okay, here's what you're going to do. But I think for the most part, our lives are storied lives, and Ignatius is no different. And as we begin to sort of go back through his life and try to make connections between, say, the exercises and his life stories, I think we'll find that really revealing. And it also makes him more human to us. Because his life was hard. I mean, it was really about struggle and painful self-deprivation at times, but these things led to the exercises, and I think that gives us a different connection to them, and I'd find that to be a very valuable exercise.